Listen, Leo, I appreciate the, passion for your petunias, Brenda said, her voice drier than a week-old scone. But Chapter 4, Section B, Subsection 12 is explicit on unauthorized water dispersion, particularly where it concerns a non-compliant hose coupling. The fine is $500. I stared at her. Brenda was the municipal compliance officer for our meticulously boring suburban enclave. She had the eyes of a tax auditor and a clipboard that, I swear, vibrated with self-importance. She looked like she ironed her khaki uniform using rules and regulations instead of steam. Unauthorized water dispersion? I repeated, my voice rising an octave above its usual level of conversational annoyance. It's a drip, Brenda. A single, sputtering droplet every 4 seconds. It's what physicists call surface tension failure, not a crime against the entire water table. She didn't blink. The infraction is the failure of the conveyance mechanism to maintain adequate hydrostatic pressure containment. The fine stands. I threw my hands up in the air. The object of this high-stakes, life-altering drama was lying right there on my otherwise immaculate, drought-resistant lawn. A cheap, 10-year-old green garden hose. The leak wasn't even on the hose itself. It was right where the rubber met the metal coupling, a tiny, almost imperceptible sputter that misted the air like a depressed water fountain. My petunias, which were, by the way, displaying a truly magnificent shade of magenta that year, a testament to my dedication, looked suitably confused by the sudden appearance of local government. $500, I muttered, shaking my head. For a 30-cent washer that decided to retire early. I could buy 7 new hoses for that, Brenda. 7 perfectly compliant, non-sputtering hoses. The cost is immaterial, Leo. It is the precedent. We have documentation indicating this is your 3rd warning regarding external plumbing runoff this month. Furthermore, your current hose is clearly marked non-industrial grade, which violates Section B's requirement for continuous conveyance integrity on properties exceeding a 1/4 acre. That was the last straw. A non-industrial grade hose? Were we living in the Roman Empire? Did I need to petition the Senate for permission to water my damn petunias? This was no longer about a hose or a fine. This was about a small, miserable woman armed with a rule book attempting to exert tyrannical control over my pursuit of horticultural excellence. You know, I pay my property taxes, Brenda. I leaned in conspiratorially, as if sharing nuclear codes. I fund this entire system of compliance and bureaucracy that allows you to stand on my lawn and lecture me about the structural integrity of a 50-foot rubber tube. And what does the system give me in return? A $500 fine for a dribble that irrigates an area roughly the size of a postage stamp. Brenda pulled, her pen from her breast pocket. If you continue with the belligerent rhetoric, I will have to cite you for obstruction of compliance review, which carries an additional $100 penalty. Obstruction? I let out a laugh that was a little too high-pitched and maniacal for the otherwise tranquil afternoon. Oh, I wouldn't dream of obstructing. In fact, you've inspired me, Brenda. You've truly opened my eyes to the deficiencies of my water conveyance system. I stared at the tiny, sputtering leak. My eyes drifted from the humble hose coupling to the sky, and then back down to the ground. Fixing the leak was the sensible thing to do. Paying the fine was the easy way out. Both were admissions of defeat. Both meant letting the pettiness of the municipal compliance office win. But if the problem was conveyance integrity, then the solution wasn't just fixing a cheap piece of rubber. The solution had to be better. It had to be so grand, so historically significant, so ridiculously over-engineered, that Brenda's little rulebook would look like a napkin menu from a greasy diner next to the Library of Alexandria. The solution needed to scream, "I dare you to fine me again." My savings account flashed before my eyes. My plans for a sensible granite kitchen countertop dissolved into a mist of concrete dust and Roman imperial ambition. The principle was the thing. The principle was worth every penny of my retirement fund, because the principle was petty, glorious revenge. I looked Brenda dead in her cold, regulation-compliant eyes. The sarcasm dripped from my voice, thick and sticky like warm tar. "Oh, you want to talk about water transportation efficiency, Brenda?" "Fine," I declared, tossing the offending hose aside. It landed with a pathetic, rubbery thump. "You think I'm going to stick another shoddy plastic nozzle onto my half-inch copper pipe? No, no, Brenda, you have forced my hand. You have raised the stakes. You just wait. You watch me transport water. You watch me build a system so compliant, so elegant, so fundamentally correct that your little subsection 12 will weep and beg for forgiveness. You just wait." I punctuated my dramatic threat by picking up a small pebble and tossing it into the yard. It was unnecessary, but it felt right. Brenda sighed, a sound of profound boredom and administrative fatigue. She scribbled something else on the clipboard, probably protagonist exhibiting signs of delusion, and then looked up, her expression unchanging. "Have a wonderful day, Leo. The fine is payable within 30 days. She turned and marched back to her official white sedan, her posture suggesting she was walking directly into a meeting with the gods of zoning law. I stood on my lawn, my eyes fixed on the retreating vehicle, already planning the logistics of my glorious, expensive, and completely unnecessary act of civil engineering warfare. The war had begun, and the enemy was a hose, coupling. The first thing I did was march inside and fire up the laptop. I didn't search for better hose coupling or how to talk to a maniacal compliance officer. No. My search history for the next 3 days was a testament to glorious, beautiful madness. Aqueductus Romanus, Pont du Gard maximum height, and structural integrity of load-bearing stone arches versus suburban zoning laws. I fell down a historical rabbit hole that smelled suspiciously of damp earth and centuries-old ambition. I learned about Vitruvius, the Spicus, the channel itself, and the stunning efficiency of structures that were built not just to move water, but to embody the sheer, unadulterated power of the Roman Empire. They didn't just fix a leak, they built a monument to getting things done. My focus settled on the Pont du Gard. It wasn't just a bridge, it was a defiant middle finger to topography, a beautiful arc of stone mocking the very concept of gravity. That was it. That was the energy I needed. I didn't just want to water my petunias. I wanted to do it with a water flow system that would make Emperor Claudius nod approvingly. I started referring to my backyard as my ager publicus, public land, obviously, and my petunias as my hortus triumphalis, triumphal garden. I was no longer Leo, the suburban homeowner. I was Leo, the self-proclaimed aedile of aquatic affairs. The next logical step was to destroy the enemy's fortress, the code. Brenda had cited Chapter 4, Section B, Subsection 12. I found it online. It was a dense, painful read, the literary equivalent of gnawing on a dry sponge. But I pressed on, fueled by $500 worth of spite. The key sentence was, all systems conveying water across property lines or from the principal source to a secondary distribution point shall utilize compliant piping or flexible hose material adhering to ASTM standards for pressure. Bam. There it was. My glorious unintentional loophole. Piping. Flexible hose material. An aqueduct is neither of those things. An aqueduct is a concrete trough, an open-channel waterway. It uses gravity, not pressure. It doesn't adhere to ASTM standards for pressure. It adheres to the immutable laws of physics and the standards of ancient stonework. I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my instant coffee. It was the most beautiful act of legal negligence I had ever seen. The city planners had covered every type of pressurized modern plumbing, but they had clearly never imagined some petty lunatic would dust off the history books and revert to 1st century BCE technology just to spite a municipal compliance officer. My design phase was less engineering marvel and more artistic seizure. I ditched the blueprints and grabbed the closest writing implement, a handful of my nephew's primary color crayons. On a discarded pizza box, I sketched my masterpiece. It would begin at my house, climb over the shed, loop around the big oak tree with an ornamental arch, naturally, and culminate in a final dramatic drop over my petunia patch. The whole thing would need to be about 15 feet high to achieve the proper hydrostatic slope, a height that would ensure it was visible from the street, and more importantly, visible from Brenda's administrative window if she drove past. I drew 3 tiers of arches, just like the Pont du Gard, even though 2 tiers were demonstrably unnecessary for the 2-foot height difference I needed to cover. Function follows form, I reasoned. Or perhaps madness follows fine. The pizza box drawing was labeled in bold red crayon, Aqua eo pereamus, Brenda, Latin for "Let us perish by water, Brenda," which sounded epic, even if it wasn't the exact translation I was looking for. Now, for the cruel, cold reality. The budget. I logged into my savings account. It was labeled Leo's Sensible Kitchen Renovation Fund, Granite Countertops. Total balance, $18,500. I stared at the number. Granite countertops versus petty, historically significant concrete-based revenge. The principle, I reminded myself, was now worth more than the stone. I moved all $18,500 into a new account. I named it the Brenda Defense Fund, Concrete Division. My sanity was gone, but my commitment to architectural spite was now absolutely financially binding. It was time to find someone crazy enough or desperate enough to build my monument. The search for a contractor was its own special kind of hell. I quickly realized that most professionals in the building trades operate under the premise of utility and structural necessity. My project violated both principles with gleeful abandon. The first guy I called was a local legend named Masonry Joe. He specialized in beautiful, high-end patios, retaining walls, and outdoor fireplaces. His voicemail used the word artisanal. I knew he was exactly the wrong person, which meant he was the perfect starting point for my descent into engineering insanity. Joe showed up the next day, a burly man with a gentle face and hands that looked like they could shape mountains. I skipped the pleasantries and immediately unfurled my pizza box blueprint. "So, Joe," I said, gesturing grandly at the crayon-scribbled arches. "I require a load-bearing, gravity-fed water channel, 3 tiers of arches, approximately 15 feet high at its apex, crossing my property line by precisely 7 feet, 2 inches. I'm thinking pre-stressed concrete, though I'm open to a limestone veneer for authenticity." Joe took off his hard hat, scratched his head, and looked from the pizza box to the vast emptiness of my backyard. He was silent for a good 30 seconds. "Mr. Leo," he finally said, his voice slow and deliberate, I appreciate the vision, but why? Why not just get a new pipe? I can trench a compliant PVC line for you in an afternoon. Joe, you misunderstand. I don't want a pipe. A pipe is surrender. A pipe is what the hoi polloi use. I need a monument. I need an infrastructure project that shouts defiance at arbitrary bureaucracy. Think of this as my own personal Via Appia, but instead of soldiers and supplies, it transports water to my award-worthy petunias. Joe sighed and tapped the pizza box. The slope here, you've got a 1-degree drop across 60 feet. That's feasible. But why are you building a triumphal arch over your shed? The shed's not structurally rated for a concrete load. The arch is ornamental. It's for the aesthetics. It's to honor the historical precedent of the Roman architectural genius, Joe. You're thinking like a modern contractor. I need you to think like an imperial engineer, circa 50 AD. Joe slowly backed toward his truck, putting his hard hat back on. Look, I got a big retaining wall job coming up, for the Jensens down on Elm. They want sandstone. Beautiful sandstone. We can talk about maybe a nice patio or a little water feature. A water feature is a dribbling garden gnome, Joe. I need a public works project. I think, Joe said, his hand already on his truck door, I need to check my schedule. My son's got a thing for the next 8 months. I'll give you a call. He drove away faster than strictly necessary, leaving tire marks of polite refusal on my driveway. Contractor number 2, 3, and 4 all had similar reactions, ranging from nervous laughter to outright suspicion that I was using this as a cover to build a meth lab. Then came Mitch. Mitch was 22, had a patchy beard, and drove a beat-up pickup truck that looked like it had lost a fight with a salvage yard. He ran Mitch's Modular Builds and More, which mostly consisted of assembling prefabricated sheds. He was clearly ambitious, and, more importantly, clearly desperate for my absurd sum of cash. He arrived, looked at the pizza box design, looked at the backyard, and then looked back at the pizza box. So, Mitch said, chewing on the end of a pencil, this is a big bird feeder? It's a functional aqueduct, Mitch, a testament to classical engineering and spite. I launched into my spiel about hydrostatic pressure, Spica's dimensions, and Brenda's betrayal. To his credit, Mitch didn't laugh or run. He just looked calculating. Okay, so it's a big, high concrete gutter, Mitch summarized, simplifying centuries of Roman history into a single phrase. My main concern is the engineering. I usually just build walls. You're asking for load-bearing pillars and structural integrity for water flow at 15 feet. That's technically a bridge, sir. Exactly, Mitch. A water bridge. And bridges need arches. And the ornamental arches over the shed need to be precisely scaled to the Arch of Septimius Severus. Mitch's eyes glazed over. Look, man, I can pour concrete. I can tie rebar. I can calculate a foundation. If you give me the specs on the height and the pillar spacing and you sign a document saying I'm not responsible when this thing collapses during a drizzle, I'm in. But I need about $25,000 to start. And I'm gonna need more rebar than I used on the entire subdivision of Riverbend last year. I beamed. Mitch, you're an artist. $25,000 it is. And add another $5,000 for the cost of 2 limestone lions at the terminus. They don't have to be real limestone, but they need to convey the gravitas of a truly conquered foe. Mitch didn't ask about the lions. He just nodded, his eyes fixed on the checkbook I was pulling out. Yes, sir. Gravitas conveyed. Start time is Monday. The building chaos was spectacular. Mitch had 2 guys, a nervous young man named Diego, and a silent, powerfully built man named Barry, who seemed to communicate only through the efficient swinging of a sledgehammer. They spent the first 3 days digging the foundation footings, and Leo spent 3 days hovering over them. "Diego, make sure that formwork is perfectly plumb," I'd yell. "The Romans had no tolerance for leaning structures. This is not the Tower of Pisa. This is the beginning of the Aqua Appia, Leo." "Leo, it's going in your petunia patch," Diego replied, wiping sweat from his brow. "It just needs to hold up the concrete. No, Diego, it needs to hold up my dignity. It needs to look down upon the surrounding neighborhood with benevolent, monolithic superiority." The biggest conflict came over the purely ornamental arches. Mitch had laid out a simple 2-foot-wide trough supported by 4 solid utilitarian concrete pillars, a simple trestle bridge. I vetoed it immediately. "Mitch, where's the architecture? Where's the history? It looks like a concrete park bench." "It's structurally sound, Leo. We don't need the arches for support. It's a 60-foot span. It's going to cost a fortune in formwork alone." "I don't care. I paid the Brenda Defense Fund for arches, Mitch. 3 tiers. The water channel goes on the top tier, obviously. The middle tier can be a walkway for me to perform inspection patrols. And the bottom tier? Purely aesthetic. It elevates the visual experience. It needs to look authentically imperial." Mitch argued for an hour, detailing the cost of lumber for the curved arch forms, the extra rebar, and the impossibility of pouring such fine detail without highly specialized equipment. I wrote him another check for $3,000, calling it a historical accuracy bonus. Mitch stopped arguing and started building the ornamental arches. The noise was relentless. The rhythmic thumping of Barry's sledgehammer, the grinding of the mixer, and my constant self-important lectures about Roman geometry turned my quiet suburban street into a construction zone worthy of a major municipal project. That's when Mrs. Henderson, my next-door neighbor, made her move. Mrs. Henderson was a human seismograph for non-compliance. She didn't talk, she commented. She appeared one morning, pruning shears in hand, pretending to trim her pristine boxwood hedge while slowly inching toward the construction site. "Morning, Leo," she called, her voice sweet and high-pitched, like the sound of distant, judgmental wind chimes. "My grandson couldn't nap yesterday. The racket." "Ah, Mrs. Henderson, welcome. You're witnessing history," I replied, standing next to a mountain of excavated dirt, feeling like Julius Caesar after a successful siege. "We're currently laying the foundations for the Aqua Leo, a modern tribute to the classical Roman water conveyance system. We've just finished tying the rebar for the pilae, the support pillars." "Pillars," she repeated, her eyes narrowed. "They look rather high, Leo, higher than your fence. I seem to recall a neighborhood covenant about structures exceeding 6 feet in height." "Ah, but Mrs. Henderson, a covenant refers to structures of habitation, or structures designed for storage," I said, pointing dramatically to the rebar cage that would soon be a concrete pillar. "This is an agricultural feature. It is an elaborate load-bearing planter support. I am merely elevating my irrigation system to ensure maximum gravitational efficiency and a superior watering pressure for my magenta petunias. Besides, this height is vital for the proper 2-degree slope required for optimal water velocity. You wouldn't want my water to become stagnant, would you? That would be a health code violation, far worse than a leaky hose, I assure you." Mrs. Henderson's face, usually set in an expression of mild disgust, actually twitched. She knew I had researched the code as meticulously as she had. She sniffed. "Well, I hope that concrete is cured properly. It would be a terrible shame if all that history ended up in my prize-winning azaleas." "Fear not, Mrs. Henderson. Mitch is using Type 3 Portland cement, low water-to-cement ratio. It will be stronger than the Colosseum. It will withstand the scrutiny of history and the relentless judgment of nosy neighbors." She retreated, defeated for now, her pruning shears snapping angrily at a perfectly healthy boxwood leaf. The contractor catastrophe was expensive, loud, and constantly on the verge of collapsing. But it was glorious. The concrete poured, the arches were set, and the monumental stupidity of the project began to take physical form. 3 weeks later, the Aqueducts was a stark, gray, and frankly terrifying monstrosity bisecting my backyard. The ornamental arches were poured, the channel was smoothed, and it sat 15 feet in the air, a concrete serpent mocking the laws of suburban aesthetic decency. It looked exactly like what it was, a project dreamed up by a man who had lost his mind over a $500 fine. The call came, inevitably, from Brenda. "Leo, I have received 3 separate, high-priority complaints regarding the, and I quote, unauthorized, concrete fortification on your property." Her voice was dangerously calm, the kind of calm a hurricane achieves just before it makes landfall. Yes, Brenda. You mean the Aqueducts. I was just about to send you a formal notification pursuant to Section G, which states that all large-scale agricultural projects must be documented for municipal records. It's almost complete. You must come see the specus. It's flawless. Leo, I am already here, and I am looking at it. I am standing next to Mrs. Henderson's hedge, and this thing is taller than my sedan. What exactly is this structural nightmare? I marched out, beaming with the perverse pride of a man who just completed a moon landing using duct tape and rage. Brenda was standing stiffly on my property line, her clipboard held like a shield. She looked genuinely aghast. I had exceeded her wildest expectations for petty retaliation. "It's the Aqueducts, Brenda. It's a testament to the fact that when you fail to provide adequate, non-leaky water conveyance via modern infrastructure, a citizen must turn to the reliable, time-tested methods of the ancients. It's an above-ground, open-channel water conveyance monument." "It is a structure," Brenda spat out the word like it was rotten fruit. "And it violates the 15-foot height limit for non-dwelling structures, and it certainly violates the bulk plane requirements for any permanent fixture." Brenda, now we get to the legal fun," I said, crossing my arms. This was the moment I had spent 2 weeks meticulously rehearsing in front of my bathroom mirror. "You are citing the code for structures, but you failed to define what constitutes a structure, other than it being related to habitation or storage. I, however, am arguing that this is an ornamental irrigation feature, which falls under the umbrella of agricultural infrastructure. And even if we call it a structure, it is not a pipe or a hose. I refer you back to Chapter 4, Section B, Subsection 12. Where does it mention a load-bearing, gravity-fed concrete aqueduct? Brenda flipped frantically through her clipboard pages. "It doesn't, but it doesn't have to. It falls under general structural codes. It's a permanent fixture requiring a building permit." "I didn't apply for a building permit because it is not a building. It does not have a roof, walls, or a foundation in the traditional sense, but rather pili and an open-air specus. Show me the section that says I need a permit to elevate my petunia watering system." She slammed the clipboard shut. Her face was a terrifying shade of puce. "This is ridiculous. I am issuing a stop work order based on questionable structural integrity and imminent safety hazard." "Too late, Brenda. The concrete cured 2 days ago. The work is done. It's permanent. You can't stop what has already been built." I pointed to the final pillar. "Behold the Aqueducts, built on principle, poured with spite." That's when Brenda reached for her phone and did the only thing she could. She called in bigger guns. "I need a police presence at 4 to 12 Sycamore Street. I have a situation involving a code violation, a civilian, and a large, unauthorized concrete bridge in his backyard. Within 10 minutes, a police cruiser pulled up. Out stepped Officer Dave, a man who looked like he'd been on the job 30 years too long and had seen it all, until now. Officer Dave had the tired, weary eyes of a man who'd hoped to spend his afternoon directing traffic around a misplaced shopping cart, not mediating a zoning dispute with a self-proclaimed Roman engineer. "What in the actual hell is that?" Officer Dave asked, staring up at my aqueduct. "It's a functional water conveyance system, officer," I explained, adopting my most reasonable, calm demeanor. "A response to the city's draconian fines concerning leaky hoses." Brenda stepped forward, her voice tight with indignation. "Officer, the civilian here, Leo, has constructed this massive 15-foot high concrete monstrosity without permits in direct violation of municipal height limits. I have issued a stop work order, but he claims the work is complete." Officer Dave looked at me, then up at the arch, then back at me. "Sir, is this thing stable? Is it going to fall on someone?" "It is engineered according to the principles of Roman architecture, officer. Its structural integrity is designed to last millennia. Ask Mitch, my contractor. He was nervous, but he followed my vision." Officer Dave turned to Brenda. "Ma'am, structural integrity is a fire marshal's call, or maybe an engineering department issue. I handle public safety. Is this blocking the street? Is it on fire? Is it currently assaulting anyone?" "It is a clear safety hazard," Brenda insisted. "A child could climb it. It's unauthorized." I stepped in. "Officer, I have documents here proving that the structure is classified, via a loophole in the zoning code, as a non-dwelling agricultural feature, thus exempting it from the standard 15-foot limit. Furthermore, I have a signed liability waiver from the contractor. And I can assure you, the moment a child tries to climb it, I will inform them of the superior structural qualities of the segmental arch versus the semicircular arch, and they will lose interest immediately." I pulled out my hastily printed copy of Mitch's blueprints and a copy of the zoning code. Officer Dave reluctantly took the papers and began to skim them, running a hand over his forehead. The dialogue between Officer Dave and Brenda was pure, distilled, bureaucratic gold. Officer Dave: "Ma'am, he's pointing out that the code uses the terms pipe and hose. This thing is neither. It's an open trough. Did the city ever consider an aqueduct might be built?" Brenda, hissing: "It is a purposeful circumvention of the spirit of the law, officer. It's designed purely to spite the city. It's malicious compliance." Officer Dave, to me: "Sir, is that true? You built this whole thing just to spite the city over a $500 fine?" Me, smiling sweetly: "Spite is an ugly word, officer. I prefer to think of it as pedagogical infrastructure development. Brenda taught me a lesson about compliance. I am simply applying that lesson on a scale worthy of the fine." Officer Dave closed the codebook, handed it back, and let out a long, suffering sigh. He looked at Brenda, his exhaustion palpable. "Ma'am, I'm not an expert on Roman engineering or agricultural features. All I see is a large, ugly concrete thing that is currently stationary on his own property, and he seems to have found a technicality that allows it to exist. Unless it collapses, or he diverts the municipal water flow, which he hasn't done yet, this is a civil matter. I can't arrest him for spite. I'm going to have to let the city's legal department handle the Aqua Leo." He looked at me one last time. "Just don't let it fall on anybody, sir. And please, use your inside voice when discussing load-bearing structures." Officer Dave got back into his cruiser and pulled away, the squeak of his tires sounding like a tiny cry of freedom. I had won the battle. The aqueduct stood. The law in the form of a weary cop, had blinked. With the police gone, and Brenda temporarily routed, Mitch and his crew moved into the final mad dash phase. They were no longer mere contractors. They were artisans of absurdity, soldiers of satire. Mitch had even started wearing a cheap plastic Centurion helmet he bought online. "Veni, vidi, vici, Leo!" Mitch shouted one morning, mixing the last batch of concrete. "We're ready for the spikas lining." "Excellent, Mitch. Ensure the final coat is perfectly smooth. Water friction is the enemy of efficiency. And the banner. Did Barry finish the banner?" Barry, the silent giant, grunted and unfurled a massive hand-painted sheet of plywood. Across it, in clumsy gold letters, were the words, "Aqua gratia." "Water by grace," I translated proudly. "Perfect. A fitting tribute to my gracious victory over petty bureaucracy." The moment of truth arrived in the late afternoon. The water source for the Aqua Leo was a new, compliant, non-leaky pipe that I had installed underground. This new pipe connected directly to my main line and fed into a small concrete basin at the aqueduct's highest point. The sheer irony of using compliant plumbing to feed a monument of defiance was not lost on me. I stood next to the main valve. Mitch held a cheap plastic stopwatch, and Diego was at the far end, ready to receive the first glorious gravity-fed flow. "Ready, Leo?" Mitch yelled. "Ready! Let the rivers run!" I slowly opened the valve. The water surged into the initial basin. There was a pause as the 60-foot-long concrete channel filled. Then a low, gurgling sound began. The water, driven by the meticulous, if arbitrary, slope I had insisted upon, began its journey. It wasn't majestic. It was loud. The open channel caused a tremendous amount of splashing noise, and the water velocity was actually too high, causing it to slosh over the sides slightly near the final drop. But it flowed. A continuous, open-air stream of municipal water carried by concrete arches into a small collection pool above my magenta petunias. It was the most inefficient, noisy, and unnecessary watering system in the history of the suburb. It was perfect. Mitch, Diego, and Barry erupted in cheers. I threw my arms up, a victorious dictator surveying his conquered territory. "We did it!" I shouted to the heavens. "We have achieved hydrological superiority!" The celebration was cut short by the familiar sound of tires crunching on my gravel driveway. Brenda. She arrived not in her white sedan, but in a small, unmarked municipal vehicle, accompanied by a man in a suit, who looked even sadder than Officer Dave. Brenda marched right up to the base of the aqueduct, where the final, glorious cascade was spraying mist everywhere. She looked at the water flow, then at the Aqua Gratia banner, and then up at me. I stood on the inspection walkway of the middle arch tier, purely for dramatic effect, of course. "Welcome, Brenda. I trust the aesthetic improvement to the neighborhood is to your liking? Do you have any concerns regarding the structural integrity of the opus caementicium?" Brenda ignored the Latin. She sighed, that same soul-crushing administrative sigh, and then she looked me dead in the eye. "Mr. Leo," she began, pulling a single sheet of embossed paper from her suit jacket. The man next to her remained motionless, radiating an aura of profound legal gloom. "The Municipal Compliance Office has reviewed your case," Brenda stated, her voice devoid of emotion. "Based on your aggressive pursuit of code literalism and the fact that the original source of the violation, the leaky hose, is demonstrably retired, the fine of $500 is hereby waived." My heart swelled. Victory. Sweet, concrete-laced victory. However, she continued, the single word cutting through the splashing water like a perfectly calibrated laser. Your new structure, the, quote, above-ground open-channel water conveyance monument, now requires a new classification. Since it functions for the delivery of utility and crosses multiple spatial zones, it is now classified under the newly enacted Non-Standard Irrigation System Amendment, which was voted upon and passed by the City Council last Tuesday. I blinked. Wait, Tuesday? I was having the final pour on Tuesday. Indeed. And that amendment, as of this morning, requires all systems falling under this classification to undergo an annual ZOMT inspection by the Municipal Engineering Department covering water quality, structural decay, and overflow mitigation. She handed the paper to the sad man, who then handed it up to me. The annual inspection fee, payable upon filing for compliance, is $750. I stared at the number. 750s. More than the original fine. More than the problem I was trying to solve. The rage was gone, replaced by a kind of hysterical, manic clarity. They hadn't just defeated my workaround, they had invented a new rule just for me. They had elevated my petty defiance into a new line item on the city budget. You made a law, I stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the ridiculous paper. A whole new law just to find my aqueduct. No, Leo, Brenda corrected, a tiny, almost imperceptible smirk playing on her lips. You forced us to recognize a deficiency in the existing regulatory framework. We simply closed the loophole you so creatively exposed. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to log this as initial compliance filing. Your first payment is due in 30 days. She turned and walked away. I stood there, 15 feet in the air, next to my flowing, magnificent $750 a year monument to spite. The sound of the gushing water was suddenly mocking me, but then a flicker. A tiny, hot spark of true, unadulterated madness. I looked at the vast, dry expanse of the rest of the neighborhood. An annual fee? A whole new law? They were daring me. They were challenging the scope of my ambition. "Mitch!" I shouted down to my contractor, who was happily counting his stacks of cash. "Get the blueprints. I need to talk about expansion. This thing is too localized. If they want to charge me $750 for this little ribbon of water, imagine what they'll charge me when I start distributing to the entire South Block. We need subterranean trenches. We need to bypass the water main entirely. We need a whole new system. They want compliance? I'll give them compliance they can't even see." The fine was waived, but the war, I realized, had just gone global. The Aquileo became a local legend, albeit a deeply weird one. It was hideous, but undeniably functional. On weekends, people would slow their cars down to point at the concrete arches looming over my magenta petunias. Kids occasionally dared each other to touch the flowing water. Mrs. Henderson upgraded her complaints from noise pollution to light reflectance, claiming the smooth, wet concrete was blinding her during her 4 p.m. sunbathing session. I started charging neighborhood kids a quarter to toss a rubber duck down the Spicus for educational tours. The annual $750 fee arrived promptly, delivered by a fresh-faced intern who looked absolutely terrified of the man who built his own Roman infrastructure. I paid it, feeling a dull ache in my chest that had nothing to do with my wallet, and everything to do with the fact that bureaucracy always gets the last laugh. But the seed of my next grand project was already planted. I spent my evenings hunched over my laptop, staring at Google Earth maps of my neighborhood. I wasn't looking at houses. I was looking at drainage patterns, elevation data, and municipal utility lines. My search history now included advanced subterranean boring techniques for residential use, silent pipe-laying equipment rental, and historical feasibility of Roman sewage systems for educational purposes only. I muttered to myself, rubbing my tired eyes. A single aqueduct is amateur hour, Leo. They want compliance? Fine. I'll make my own utility company, one that bypasses their meters, their codes, and their ridiculous fees. They'll never find the pipes if they're 2 feet lower than the building code specifies for pressurized systems. I got a postcard a few weeks later. It was a picture of a miniature, beautifully carved concrete fountain. The note was from Mitch. Got the Lions approved. Thanks for the gravitas bonus. Building this for some rich eccentric in Beverly Hills who wanted subtle Mediterranean flair. You ruined me for sheds, Leo. P.S. That $750 fee is crazy, man. I smiled a genuine, if slightly unhinged smile. Mitch would be back. They all would. Because the only thing stronger than bureaucratic overreach is the human desire for petty, glorious revenge. I looked down at the new municipal letter on my desk. It wasn't a fine, or a tax, or a fee. It was a noise abatement warning for the continuous trickling sound emitted by my aqueduct. My closing thought was an ominous, sarcastic vow about starting a new project. I stood up, walked over to the monstrosity in my backyard, and looked at the flowing water, already plotting my next move. They really think they can stop me with a letter? I scoffed, speaking directly to the concrete. A noise complaint? That's all they've got? I've already contacted a guy about installing a functional, neighborhood-wide pneumatic mail system just to bypass the post office. It's a kinetic package conveyance demonstration, obviously. I paused, looking back toward the direction of Brenda's office downtown. Just you wait, Brenda. Just you wait.